Bem-vindos ao Teatro Maria Matos. Duplamente bem-vindos porque chegaram cá, apesar da greve. Sei que é um esforço. Welcome, Anne and Anna. You've come a long way, so it's great to be able to welcome you here in Lisbon. I'm just going to make some short introductory remarks and then I'll leave the word to Anna Bigotte. Well, first of all, I would like to say that, as you know, this is the fourth conference in the series of lectures on the theme Gender Trouble that we've started at the beginning of this month. And these lectures are kind of a backbone of a whole series of activities, amongst which also performances and workshops and events in the public space. And I'd just like to draw your attention to a couple of events that will happen this weekend. There is a workshop on Saturday, a workshop Drag King by a group from Madrid, which is called en Conflicto. There is also a special event, Walking Holding, by Rosanna Cade, who is an artist from Scotland, from Glasgow, which is a special event in which they take you in a walk around the city. But you can read more about it in our program. And there is also a performance, a double bill with two performances by Vera Monteiro, and another performance. There are two short performances, so they fit into one program. It's a piece by Vera Monteiro, which already exists a good couple of years, which is called É uma misteriosa coisa, disse o E.E. Cummings. E Après le Bain is the performance by Mariana Tegner Barros. They will be shown on Sunday evening. Okay, I would also like to remind you of the presence of Livraria Marcel down in the foyer with an excellent choice of books on the theme, on performance and gender. It's worthwhile to take a look. And then some thanks, which is in the first place to the network House on Fire, who is supporting these thematic events with the support of the European Union, the culture program of the European Union. This event is also being live streamed on internet through the support of the Fundação para a Ciência e a Tecnologia, and the event is also supported by the newspaper Público as a media sponsor. That's it. I just want to say still that this work was made especially for this event. It was made by João Pedro Vale, Nuno, Alexandre Ferreiro. Have a good evening. Anna.
Thank you for coming. Thank you, Anne Pellegrini. I'll start by introducing Anne, and I'll do it in Portuguese. Okay. So, Anne Pellegrini é professora de Estudos de Performance e Análise Social e Cultural na Universidade de Nova Iorque, onde também dirige o Centro de Estudos de Género e Sexualidade. Na sua obra, destacam-se Performance Anxieties, Staging Psychoanalysis, Staging Race and Love the Scene, Sexual Regulation and the Limits of Religious Tolerance, co-escrito com Janet Jacobson. O seu livro mais recente, em parceria com Michael Bronchi e Michael Amico, You Can Tell Just by Looking and 20 Other Myths About LGBT Life and People, foi nomeado para o Prémio Literário Lambda para a melhor obra de não-ficção LGBTQI em 2014. Anne?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here this evening, and thank you all for making it here to the theater. I hear tell that transportation was somewhat difficult today. Making my flight in yesterday from New York seemed like a simpler matter. So it's really a pleasure to be here.
We'll hear argument now in number 9026, Michael Barnes versus Glenn Theater, Inc. Mr. Ewell.
Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court. In Indiana, under Indiana Code Section 35,
second year of graduate school as this book was in press. And I went to a little seminar. It was a very little seminar that she was invited to do. There were a few other graduate students there. Again, it was before Gender Trouble came out. I knew that this was a spectacularly brilliant person. Her work was really excited. I didn't understand it yet, but I wanted in, right? So this book has made possible so much work politically and academically thinking about what gender does in the world. Her work has been deeply influential in gender and sexuality studies and feminist studies and what has come to be called queer theory, but it also deeply influential in other fields, philosophy, literary studies, performance studies, which I'll say a little bit more about, and also in religious studies, which is one of the other areas I work in. So it's really exciting, but also a bit humbling to be talking about this book or thinking with you, given that I sort of can't imagine my thought without it. It's been so much there, shaping conversations and shaping questions and in really deep and interesting ways. And I hope I will have you converted to it by the end of the evening if you're not yet there. And I should also say that I am speaking English tonight far too quickly again. If you were a first language English speaker, I speak far too quickly. But part of the struggle in language is also a part of the argument of her book, that we have a set of terms for gendered life, for sexed life, that are deeply inadequate to the much more multiple ways in which we live in our bodies and interact with others. But we have to use language. Language also uses us. So some of the stumbling I might do as I struggle to sort of clarify Butler's work, but also some other texts I'm thinking with, that stumbling might in fact be a kind of analogy or a mime for what it is to be in language and have to stumble in it and through it as well. I'll come back to those points. All right, I'm going to be thinking sort of two of the axes for this conversation tonight are the philosopher of the speech act, the philosopher of language, J.L. Austin, How to Do Things with Words, a book that was published after his death. I believe it was published in 1962. So, but it was compiled from a series of lectures he gave live in 1955. And I want to think about why that book is so crucial to performance studies, and then what Judith Butler's work in thinking about gender as a performative does with that book, right? So I'm in at least three different fields. I teach in gender and sexuality studies and performance studies, and I also teach the critical study of religion. And I'm really interested in how we can think performance across different domains. Performance is a much broader category than theater, broader still even than performance art. It refers also to everyday actions, to gestures, to political protest, to the work of the state, how the law grabs us. So I'm thinking performance as a category really capaciously. And both these texts, How to Do Things with Words, and then Gender Trouble, first published in 1990, help us do some of that work. I'm going to be beginning with spending more time on Austin, and I'll be coming back. I'll be threading the Butler through with some examples, but let's first talk a little bit about Austin's How to Do Things with Words. Actually, a quick informational question. Has anyone read that book before, How to Do Things with Words? All right, a few fingers up. And is it, again, this is one of the foundational texts in speech act philosophy, and the philosophy of how language works. So the work of Austin and John Searle, deeply influential in how philosophers think about language's action in the world. And it's become a founding text, really critical to performance studies as well. And one of the things that Austin does, and I'm just going to give a nutshell for it, it's a deceptively little book. Actually, I have a copy. I'm going to show you. It's like a sacred object. I'll show it to you. I didn't bring my copy of, I have multiple copies of Gender Trouble. I should have brought you my first edition copy of it, right, to really go whole hog with the holy relics. But so here's my little copy of How to Do Things with Words. And like I said, it's a little book, right, really deceptive. And it's a fantastic read. I highly encourage, it has had some translations. I don't think it's available in Portuguese, but it's actually a really interesting meditation on what words do in the world. And Austin sort of begins by making an apparently simple distinction between a sentence as a description, like language as describing a state of affairs in the world, and then you would test that state description. You'd ask of it, is it true or is it false? Right? And he contrasts the descriptive function of language, and he actually is talking about words, sentences, so at the very basic level. And he contrasts that to sentences that he calls performative. performative utterances. And those kinds of utterances or sayings actually do as they say. They actually are not a description of a state of affairs in the world. They are changing the world and the relations between speaker and hearer, or hearers, in the moment of utterance. And so his chief example, the kind of exemplary example, is the marriage ceremony and the words that get exchanged between the parties who are getting married and then the person who presides over the ceremony, a religious figure or maybe a justice of the peace, a judge. And that there are words, they're actually an important formula. But the saying of these words is not separate, he's arguing, from the becoming married. The words are the action. So it's not descriptive, it's performative, the words as a doing. And so the question you ask of a performative utterance, the doing, I dare you, right? I dare you to run outside, race around the building, and come back in within 5 minutes, right? The dare, the saying of the words, I dare, is the dare. I promise you that if you run outside, run around the building for 5 minutes, I'll buy you a beer at the bar. A promise. Now, I may or may not buy you that beer if you run around. You'll have to find out, right? So then you could find out, was it a happy promise or an unhappy promise? Like, is it achieved in the world? So the question of a performative utterance is not true or false. It's felicity. It's happiness. Was it happy or unhappy? Or maybe it could misfire, which is another word that Austin uses, to misfire. So it misfired perhaps because, well, let's go to the marriage ceremony, which is this chief example of a performative utterance. So you have someone who is empowered by the state to preside over a marriage ceremony. And I already cooked my example. The parties getting married have to belong to the category of the human. So Portugal, since 2010, it could be 2 women, could be 2 men, not just a heterosexual couple, right? In the United States, probably at the end of June, it will be possible in the entire country for 2 women and 2 men to marry each other. But the right parties have to be married. As Austin says, you can't marry an ape. I feel like this is very speciesist. Let's hear it for the apes, right? He means that literally, not the figurative ways in which we might speak about a former lover. Such an ape, right? But what's the larger context? It's not enough. It has to be it has to be authorized in the right way. So there's something he's giving us. Again, very deceptively simple, but it turns out that for the performative utterance to work, and again, his chief example is marriage. It has to have the authority of sort of the law behind it. The right context, the right circumstances, and the right authorized individuals. The ones saying the words, the ones hearing the words and repeating them in some way. So suddenly, the simple scene of the performative utterance involves a social history, who can marry. It involves the law, which regulates this. It involves an audience. So it's not also, because you have to have a witness. Again, I think it's really crucial that this is the example he gives, because it's not just 2 people. You have actually a whole collective involved in this performative utterance to be part of what regulates and produces the condition of this saying being a doing of a particular kind. Is this making sense? So it's not just enough to say the words. The right person has to say the words to the right group of people. Only 2 can marry. There has to be at least, in the United States, there have to be at least 2 witnesses. So there have to be people. Actually, I was about to say willing to hear, but maybe they're coerced into hearing, because that's something really interesting about performative utterances. It's not just an exchange between one person and another. Quite often, there's a larger audience, like here, who are, in some sense, might be forced to hear this performative utterance and get roped into its force as well, right? I dare you, 3 of you, to run outside, right? Maybe, actually, 3 of you don't want to run outside. You get sort of coerced into it by your roommates or something. And I noticed, I left up this typo. I'm a really horrible typist, and I don't know if anyone can identify the English language typo. Do you take this woman to be your awfully wedded wife? I meant to write lawfully wedded wife, and I noticed that earlier today, and I decided, no, just let the Freudian slip, just hang it out there for everyone to see. But his chief example is the marriage ceremony, but he also talks about the dare, the promise, the swear. And one of the things that's so important, why Austin is going to be helpful for us this evening, and why his work is so important to Butler's analysis of gender as performative, gender as a doing, not gender as a stable being, but gender as a doing in the world. One of the reasons it's so important and fascinating is he constantly gives his examples by referring back to law. So his model for how the performative utterance enforces itself, actually takes effect in the world, is a model that could potentially have real force behind it, not just force as analogy, force as metaphor, real force, punishing force. And that's going to be very important for the way that Butler thinks about gender as a compulsory performance. We don't get to opt in or opt out of gender. We might get to do gender sideways to queer it, but we might risk getting punished for it too. So I think it's very significant that Austin keeps referring to the law as this chief example of how a performative utterance takes hold of subjects in the world, right? Butler's going to play with this and importantly make the claim that it's not something that a performative utterance grabs hold of you, but the performative utterance, gender as a performance. Without that performance, you couldn't be a subject at all. There isn't a pre-existing subject out there whom law grabs, whom gender norms apply to. Those gender norms produce you as a subject in the first place, who can then claim the notion of being a woman, being a man, even being transgender, right? There is no subject before gender. There is no subject before the law. Right? So it's really thickens the scene of how to do things with words. How are we doing? Okay. Right. One of the other reasons it's so significant that Austin keeps referring back to law. Law works with precedent. And I'm going to talk about a law case a little bit later on. But for law to be enforceable, it has to be repeatable. So it's not just that here's a law that works today, but tomorrow we actually, in some sense, we have to believe law will keep working, and then we might actually fear it's going to keep working too. But it's repeatable, not just into the future. It will happen. The same law is going to be in place tomorrow. But it draws on a history, a set of social conventions, the fact that it's been applied in the past. So it has this long temporality, but it's a history. Law can also be changed. But Austin talks about a performative utterance as dragging on precedent. You can't just willy-nilly invent a performative utterance. It'll be nonsense. To the hearer, certainly. So the performative utterance works in part because we're all already socialized into the conventions that make it work. We get the rules of authority. We know who's authority, who can actually make this utterance and make it mean something. We might have gotten that in a really violent way before. But the precedent is about the past that keeps working in the present, and it predicts a regularity in the future. So it has a long-range temporality. I thought it would be helpful to give an example that's of a particular kind of performative utterance. One of the other things that's interesting about language is performative, and it's actually a formula, like a set of words you say. And so in the saying of a certain formula, the action is happening at one and the same moment. Austin leads with the example of the marriage. I want to give an example from the presidential oath that I'm going to talk about President Obama, but every US president takes an oath in the following formula. It's actually the words that the president swear, I said it too soon, fast. The words that so far the man who's been elected to be president says are actually prescribed in the US Constitution. So you're supposed to say a particular formula. And in the saying of those words, the swearing of the oath, you become president. Sure, you were elected. Well, usually you were elected. But you actually have to say these magic words, and that is a performative utterance that transforms you at the same moment as you're saying them into the being of the president. This might seem like, oh, does anyone really believe this? I mean, it's just a set of words. No, people really believe it. So I want to talk about the misfire. I said earlier that a misfire can happen if the wrong person say, if I read the presidential oath, I'm not actually going to become president right before your eyes. I could try that, but it won't work. I'm not authorized to do so. I haven't met all the criteria that are the background to these magic words working on me, right? So we're not in the right context for this to happen. We don't have a judge or someone recognized by the Constitution of the United States to swear me in. So there are all sorts of reasons why I might try to say these words would misfire. But there are other kinds of misfires too. You can actually, when it comes to a formula, and there's also a ritual component, which is why this is really interesting to think with religion. You could say, if you say the words wrong, then there might be a question. Did the magic actually happen? Right, so here's an image from the first inauguration of Obama, President Obama, in January of 2009, 21st of January. Right? And these are the words that are prescribed in the US Constitution. I'll read them aloud, and I'm going to try my best to become president, but I don't think it will work. I do solemnly swear. I could also say affirm. This is, I don't want to fall down the wormhole. You have a choice between saying swear or affirm. The language of affirm is probably there to make space for Quakers who have a very strong reading of the prohibition on swearing. So if you were a Quaker of a particular believing sort, you would not say the word swear, you would say the word affirm. And as far as I know, I think only one US president has said the word affirm rather than swear. Even Richard Nixon, who was a Quaker, not a very good one, but a Quaker, said swear, not affirm. Okay. I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. These are the words specified in the Constitution. Quite often, the man who's becoming president says, so help me God, but those words are not in the Constitution. An interesting addition, so help me God. Sometimes it's done as a round robin between the person doing the swearing in and the person being sworn. Right, so let's watch. January 21st, 2009.
Are you prepared to take the oath, Senator?
I am.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear
that I will execute the office of President to the United States faithfully,
that I will execute
the office of President of the
the office
United
of President of
States,
the United States faithfully,
and will, to the best of my ability,
and will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. President. All the best wishes.
All right, so the word faithfully, and I love that it was the word faithfully, was misplaced. So that was the Chief Justice of the US Supreme Court who was swearing in Senator Obama, and he even begins by saying, "Are you ready, Senator Obama?" He's not yet president. He's been elected. All of the votes have been counted. Not only did he win the majority of the popular vote, he won the majority of the Electoral College. The electors in each state have certified to the results for each state, but he's not yet been sworn in, so he's still a senator. So there is a recognition that to speak in Catholic terms, the transubstantiation has not yet happened. So, Senator, are you ready? But the words were not properly uttered. They were not faithfully uttered. So then the question became, and this actually was a question taken up, about the felicity of it, the happiness. Was he yet president? Now, many people are unhappy with the election of Barack Obama, right? I'm talking about a different kind of happiness, and not from the perspective of someone like Austin. Was he successfully president if the formula was botched, if the words misfired? So this became actually an issue. So the next day, Justice Roberts swore him in again. They did not assemble the hundreds of thousands on the steps of the US Capitol again. It was not televised, but there were official White House photographers. So this was the next day, January 22nd. It lasted 25 seconds. He was sworn in again. And this time, the report is that the words were uttered faithfully by both parties. So Barack Hussein Obama became president, right? But so when I talk about the question of the performative utterance, it's happiness, and the question of the ritual repetition, and because these words are set out in the U.S. Constitution, to utter them in error actually created a little bit of crisis of category. Was he yet president? I'm sure that the profound racism that greeted the election of President Obama and has dogged him throughout his presidency probably was, I'm sure that didn't help some people being concerned. They didn't think he should ever get to be president. But the formula actually mattered to a lot of people, quite apart from, okay, the large issue of deep racism, right? So that's really fascinating. So, but here's an image of the next day. But I want you to notice one difference, and this is going to matter. And I've kind of distorted. So on the first day, okay, this is the left hand of is he becoming president yet? Senator to President Obama. His left hand is on a Bible, and it has become conventional. It's conventional. It is in no way set down as required in the U.S. Constitution. It would actually be unconstitutional to require anyone to swear on a Bible because we have an officially secular state. But it is conventional for the person becoming president, and actually people being sworn into political office to swear on, if not the Bible, on some sort of holy text. John Adams actually swore on a law book. He said it stood in for the U.S. Constitution. But so Obama is holding, actually he's swearing on a Bible that was owned by Abraham Lincoln. So it's profound symbolism that this is the Bible of Abraham Lincoln. Left hand in the Bible. Do you notice anything on the next day? There's no Bible.
No Bible.
Right? Just emphasis, no Bible. And I find this to be really interesting. So that the Bible is, one could argue that the putting of the left hand on the Bible, right? So you have to say a certain set of words in the right order, and it deeply matters that you say them in exactly the right order. But the gesture, where you put your hand, how you hold your body, left hand on the Bible, right hand in the air, is equally part of this performance. Or I should say performative. Which one is it? Because it turns out legally, of course, the Bible isn't needed. So the next day when they were doing this swearing in that really has to take, they didn't need the Bible any longer. But for the public performance of the performative, the Bible was symbolically necessary. So you actually have some sort of really interesting, I want to talk about this relationship between the performance, left hand on the symbolically charged Bible of Abraham Lincoln, right hand in the air, say the right words. The right words performatively transform you. But the next day when it's just, Chief Justice Roberts, the man who is he yet, is about to be President Obama, they don't need the Bible. All right. I want to talk a little bit about free speech and freedom of religion. Actually, freedom of religion precedes freedom of speech in the U.S. Constitution. So the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution actually begins with two principles of religious freedom in the United States. First, that there shall be no established religion, there's no established church. And it also is, there can be no laws that prohibit the free exercise of religion. What it means not to have an established church in practice, and what it means to provide space for the free exercise, that is practice of religion. These remain highly charged, highly difficult issues, but this is at least the opening promise of the Bill of Rights to do with religion. It's only after setting out these two related rights concerning religion, no established church, free exercise, that the Constitution then speaks about the freedom of speech. So it's interesting, and it will be interesting together to think about the relationship between freedom of religion and freedom of speech. And especially interesting because both religion and speech, legally, but I think even conceptually, and the law does not exhaust our concepts, but legally, there are really important distinctions in the United States, and my hunch is, actually not just in the United States, between belief and conduct. So in the US, you can have, belief is absolutely protected. You can believe whatever you want, but the forms of conduct that follow on that belief can be regulated by the state. In practice, the forms of conduct that get related are more often the conduct of non-Christian groups, which is interesting. I'm happy to talk about that discussion period. But speech also involves this really interesting question. When is speech about interiority, kind of belief, opinion, an idea, abstract conception? And when is speech a doing? This is why the notion of performative speech is so important. Because if speech is a doing, can the law, and the law can regulate acts. The law isn't supposed to regulate, we're not supposed to have a thought police in principle, right, that regulates what you believe or what you think. But if speech is also an action in the world, can the law step in and regulate it? What sort of action does speech have to be performing for the law to be permitted to regulate it? So this, and I think the fact that religion and speech get listed together in the First Amendment becomes really interesting. So we're going to see that certain kinds of speech that's perceived as an action produces a special anxiety when it has to do with sex, when it has to do with issues that conventionally or customarily the province of religion to regulate. And then the secular state's like, whoa, what are we going to do about this? I often confuse the words secularism and sexularism, and not for nothing is that the case. All right. So I want to think about this question of belief versus conduct. I mean, religion is, to my mind, more about practice than it is about belief. And if we think about gender as a doing that produces the experience of a being, we could say that actual rituals, practices, exercise, forming religious community with others, these produce the possibilities of interiorized identity. Identity comes in some sense second. But within Protestantism, at least, and the US has a deeply Protestant history, there's been a tendency to emphasize belief, interiority, as somehow before or instead of action. There are, so we have the promise of freedom of speech in the US Constitution, but there are 6 kinds of speech that are historically exempt from protection. And all these kinds of speech are particular kinds of action. So this is why Austin's analysis of performative utterances, speech that is a doing, not the description, speech that actually does something, becomes really interesting. And the fact that he uses law as his model actually has this kind of interesting relationship to how law itself is like caught up in the drama of speech. Law makes itself known through speech. It also gets to enforce itself through police action, right? It isn't just words. You can actually get hit on the head with a stick or thrown in prison, right? Law has force of physical conduct behind it. But law itself trips on the question, when is speaking a doing? And which kinds of doings can we recognize and regulate? And the kinds of doings, the kinds of speakings that are doings that the law recognizes are usually doings that are analogous to other kinds of deeds that are already regulatable, right? It's like, oh, we can regulate this because it's sort of like this. So just briefly, because I really want to talk about obscenity. That's why we're all here tonight, to talk about obscenity, right? The first category that's, there's a long legal tradition, it is against the law to defame, to defame or libel, right? This is basically on the model of fraud. You can't pronounce words that ruin someone's reputation. There are certain circumstances, like a celebrity, you can say nasty things about that because that person has a public reputation. So, but you can't say something that's knowingly wildly untrue about that celebrity, for example. But I won't fall down the rabbit hole further than I would like to about defamation or libel, but it's an analogy to fraud. You can't basically, or theft, you can't steal someone's reputation. So defamation or libel are like laws against fraud, laws against theft. Causing panic without cause, the chief example is always, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater unless there's actually a fire, or unless you actually believe there's a fire. You might be mistaken about that. You could be descriptively wrong, so you make the performative utterance of yelling fire, you cause a panic, but you did so with the intention, in fact, to save people's lives. You really thought there was a fire. That wouldn't be covered. But if you know that there's no fire, but you say these words to cause panic, because saying fire in a crowded theater is likely to cause panic, right? Unless you're saying it on the stage and you're a character in the play yelling fire, that might not cause a panic. But so you can't cause panic without cause. Fighting words is a really weird category. As far as I know, the Supreme Court has made this case once and then basically has backtracked ever since. But it's interesting for us to think about because it has to do with a kind of speech that is so injurious to the one who hears it that it is as if you were punched by these words. Right? This has fallen out of legal analysis in the United States, but it's been taken up outside the courts. And here we have a conversation about hate speech in the US. You might have this conversation here about sort of horrible derogatory language, ethnic slurs, sexist language, homophobic language. These are legally permissible words. We might call it hate speech, but they're legally permissible. But there was once a brief moment of analysis in the US that, in fact, that might be thinkable as a kind of fighting word. It caused such injury to the one hearing it. Judith Butler has written brilliantly about laws that attempt to criminalize hate speech or allow for civil remedies. She's written, I think, quite persuasively why such laws are not good. I'm really persuaded by her analysis. I'm happy to talk to you about that, or you can take that up with her when she's here in just a week's time. But there is this thought, well, words can really reach in and hurt you, right? The really interesting question, the only time the court has allowed this was during World War II, and it was when police officers were called fascists. Right, so the injury to the police officers, the moment they heard themselves being called, damned racketeer and damned fascist, as police officers were arresting a Jehovah's Witness who was proselytizing in public, which was legal to do, but the Jehovah's Witness was being charged with, disturbing the peace. The police officer said, "You injured me by these words." I think at this moment, officer of the state to be called a fascist had an extra charge in the U.S., and Jehovah's Witnesses not a popular minoritized religion. But there's something really interesting about whose injury under words counts for the law. Again, but that is a notion of a speech as a kind of doing. Speech could really injure you, but whose injuries count? We want to ask that question. Two other examples, briefly, incitement to crime, using speech to actually produce, if I had sufficient charisma, you tell me later, if tonight I were to encourage you to go out in the street and break all sorts of store windows, I gave you explicit directions, I incited you to commit a crime. I myself do not go out and commit these acts of vandalism with you, but I give you a really strong message. There's reason to think that you could be persuaded by me, and so I've incited you to crime. But also, it has to be close enough to my having given this talk tonight, because if you go do it a week from now, I can say, look, wasn't I who motivated you, right? So there's a temporal relation. Sedition, very controversial, especially in a time when the United States and other countries, other allies are prosecuting a war on terror. Sedition is about traitorous speech, so it's really, again, this raises really interesting political questions about whose traitorous speech is considered to be an injury to the nation, whose words are powerful, whose words are seen as scary, whose words are just dismissed as no words at all. Right? Now, I want to talk about a category of speech that the court has struggled with for a long time in the United States. Is it speech? Is it expression? So it could be protected, or is it an action? What kind of action is it, if so? And what makes it bad and harmful? Obscenity law in the United States, as much law in the United States, drafts off of British common law, so we inherited a set of customary ways of interpreting law from Great Britain. And for a long time, obscenity was about sort of, having a negative effect, sexual images, sexual words, even just getting a pamphlet in the mail that advertised contraceptives. This was actually illegal in the United States for a long time, but this could have a negative effect on very susceptible individuals. So the obscenity was scary because someone who was weak of will, weak of mind, so women, children, the mentally enfeebled, these were the conversations. People who were not, basically, they weren't white Christian men who were already upstanding citizens, so they were at risk of these words, these images injuring them, especially to do with sex, because it would give them bad ideas. They might do something in relationship to these words that they saw. So obscenity was being regulated because of its the perceived or feared effect on especially susceptible persons. A series of cases in the late 1950s and then early 70s then started to clarify that actually the judge of obscenity was not its projected impact on a susceptible person, but because if you regulate something because a weak group of people would be affected by it, then you really need to have law regulating for the strong. It actually is this a really interesting shift. So then instead it's about, will it affect the average person? Will this person's experience of this material simply be an experience of that his, maybe her, but really his prurient interest, improper lustful response, right? So that there's something about this material that does something to the reader, to the viewer. And this could be a book, this could be a film, this could be a play, this could be images. All of these are understood under the category of speech. So we have now a broad set of things count as speech. Then the question, and this speech is a kind of doing, it affects people. This is partly why these images become a performative utterance. And insofar as they become a doing, they can then be seen as regulable, which might seem that, so obscenity is a category of speech that ceases to be speech and so can be regulated purely as conduct. But that's also too fast, because there's also this recognition that sometimes it isn't exactly a doing, it's still speech, but it's speech that we actually just don't like. The court goes back and forth, is it speech or is it not speech? And because if it's speech, it's protected. Maybe we don't like what it's expressing, that's the other issue. But we're not allowed to say we don't like what it's expressing because we're supposed to not have viewpoint discrimination. So again, why is sex causing all this trouble? Right? And the court in 1957 basically said obscenity is not protected speech. So it sort of fudges the question. So we're not going to say exactly if it's speech, but it's not protected speech. So, which seems to suggest it is a kind of speech, but speech of such degraded quality, we won't extend to it legal protection. Why? This is more wormhole than you need. But, all right, I want to get to the why. Or in this instance, the why not. Is obscenity utterance within the area of protected speech and press? The court says no, it is not. It reaffirms that position in 1973. Right, these are two really famous cases, 57 and 73. Why not? Why isn't it? And so the court doesn't have a very good answer. So it goes to history and tradition. And this is why the issue of precedent, remember I talked a little bit about precedent with respect to Austin, the history of a performative utterance. One needs to know the conventions. It has to have been enforced in the past. So the court turns to history and tradition. And it says, well, look, in the original US colonies, and then the first, and 10 of the first 14 states, those individual states had laws banning obscenity. So and they also banned libel. So there's a deep tradition of banning these two kinds of speech. The state can ban them, the state can regulate them. All right, but that doesn't yet tell us the why. I mean, history and tradition, but why was obscenity banned? And what becomes very interesting is the court, it says, well, obscenity was initially banned because it was a category of blasphemy. So it was actually heresy, a religious violation. It profaned religious speech. It profaned religious custom. So again, the First Amendment to the US Constitution begins by saying, there shall be no established church. Then it promises freedom of speech. But a form of speech has been banned in advance by remaining religious law. So Christian notions of what is permissible and impermissible speech shadow secular law about what kinds of speech is actually free and usable. So there's a way in which certain religious notions remain active even in secular law. And it gets better, well, or worse, depending upon your perspective. So the majority decision is written by Justice Brennan, somewhat of a center liberal on the court, or became so. But he wrote the majority decision in Roth, and again, he goes through history and tradition, that's why. And he quotes a Massachusetts law from 1712. I'm from Massachusetts originally, so I'm sort of almost not proud of my home state. Okay, so he goes back to a Massachusetts law, which made it criminal to publish, and these are the words of the 1712 law. So the court goes in 1957 to a 1712 law to explain why obscenity in the present is why the state can ban it, regulate it out of existence, or try to, right? So this is deep history, deep precedent. So the Massachusetts law made it criminal to publish, quote, any filthy, obscene, or profane song, pamphlet, libel, or mock sermon, right? Those are the words from the law. These are Brennan's further interpretation of the law, in imitation or mimicking of religious services. So basically, obscenity was sanctionable and bannable, partly because it was competing with religion's performance of authority. So the argument I want to make is that the punishment of obscenity, a certain class of sexual speech, was because it was one of a class of possible kinds of performative utterances that vied with religious authorities for claims on people's interest and attention. So obscenity, like other kinds of theatrical performances, because there are also laws against theatrical performances going on at the same time. So basically the problem is that obscenity performance might vie with religious sermons for claims on your souls. Right? So that there's a rivalry going on between different kinds of theatricality or different kinds of performance. There's a long history of the anti-theatrical tradition, certainly within Protestantism. One of Protestantism's beef with Catholicism was about far too much theater in Catholicism. But the anti-theatrical tradition goes back much further than just Protestantism. It goes back, think about Plato's hysteria over mimesis and poetry in the Republic, so much so that he ultimately ends up banning all forms of mimesis, or we could say performance poetry, but he bans all forms of mimesis from his ideal Republic, in part because mimesis, that is performance, that is theater, that is poetry, actually might have an equal claim to your attention, to your interest, to shaping who you are. They might give you false ideas. I want to speak up for false ideas, right? But the idea that, this is actually a recognition of the power of the aesthetic, of art, of representation to change you. So the attempt to ban obscenity is part of a larger worry about forms of representation, forms of speech that actually, in fact, are doing something to you. And they're doing so with the wrong kinds of authority behind them, right? So this, so we can think of religion and religious performance is vying with what? Secular performance, obscene performance in the context of these initial laws and obscenity. But law also competes with performance in this really interesting way. Law relies on performance. We saw the theatricality of the swearing in of Barack Obama. This is a particular performance of law. But there's the theatricality of an actual trial, right? The judges, a jury system, the way that lawyers, I mean, there's a certain theater to it, a certain set of social scripts that we know. And law has to act as if, right? Everything it says is actually real. It is authoritative. That, so the judge who is not just a character, the judge is actually somehow imbued with power. So really it's, it's not, he is fully, or she, fully identified with that role. The robe is giving us justice. Philosophy maybe competes with performance too. So I said earlier that Austin keeps going to the law as an example of a performative utterance. And he's very intent on saying that, remember I said earlier, if you yell panic in a crowded room, if you yell fire in a crowded room with the intention of causing panic, because there's no actual fire, you could actually be charged with a crime. But if you were to yell fire on stage in the course of a play, you're probably not going to be charged with a crime, right? You could be doing it as part of a scene. So Austin actually says, well, see, theatrical speech isn't actually performative speech. It's doing something else. He doesn't really know what to do with theatrical speech, but he wants to distance himself from what happens on stage. I'll come back to that, because I want to come back to that via Judith Butler's Gender Trouble. She spends a lot of time talking about action, the doing of gender as an action, but it's an action that also does often involve speech.
If I were a boy, even just for a day, I'd roll out of bed in the morning and throw on what I wanted and go.
One of the formulas with which, well, the child who is to be a subject, the child who is pre-appointed to gender, right, is greeted. It's a boy, it's a girl. These are very common pronouncements. It used to be that they might be said in the delivery room, or perhaps being said by the midwife at home, but that would be actually the first sentence uttered of this infant that's come into the world. It's a boy, it's a girl. It's the question that actually friends of expectant parents ask them, they might say, do you know if you're having a boy or a girl? Because now we get to know in advance through our new scientific technologies. Do you know if you're having a boy or a girl? Which one do you want, right? And so one of the things that's interesting, you don't even have to wait for the delivery room to find out. You can know in advance. There's a sense in which we always know in advance that someone is going to have a gender. But you can know in advance what the gender is. But actually, we don't actually know in advance what the gender is. By knowing in advance what the gender is supposed to be or supposedly is, we start anticipating that child into a gendered future. So even before our arrival, this is what I mean by saying we're pre-appointed to gender, even before our arrival in the world, that infant who will become a subject of gender is already being groomed to take up a particular position, to become the body that is a boy that will be a man, to become the body that is a girl who will be a woman, right? Now, lots of subjects don't do their gender right. Right? We can talk about genderqueer subjects or transgender subjects. Actually, a lot of people who identify with the category of male, of woman and man, and have stably female and stably male bodies don't exactly do their gender right either. There are all sorts of ways in which we misfire the doing of gender, right? But we have language that greets us, that anticipates us. But we're not really that word, right? We can identify with that category through our actions in the world and through our interactions with others, right? Gender here is a social relationship that we take up and install inside as if it came before those social relationships. The doing of gender in everyday life, the ways others interact with us, the ways we take up those rules, and then all by ourselves, right? We get trained as young people to know if you go to one of these doors, you're supposed to know which one to enter, right? We know this is sort of a international lexicon, right? We know which door we're supposed to enter, so much so that we don't even have to think twice about it. For most subjects, we can enter one door without trouble, right? We know it's second nature. But we had to learn that, right? And that learning is part of the becoming of the gender we supposedly always already were, right? Gender here was a doing. If you enter in the wrong bathroom, and there are all sorts of ways to enter into the wrong bathroom. You could actually walk through the, quote, wrong door, or you could enter a door and be perceived as others by being the wrong person in that room, right? But you could be subject to ridicule. You could be subject to violence. So these doors become a wonderful metaphor that aren't just a metaphor. They're actual physical consequences to entering, quote, the wrong door. But they also give us a picture of how language takes hold. And I almost chose a picture that had the words ladies on one door and gentlemen on the other to show that words also clothe gender, but I thought these bathing suit images were amusing. So sometimes a cheap visual image, all right. So I'm thinking here directly with Judith Butler's, really wanted to talk to us about gender as a kind of doing in the world that precedes being. Here is a long quote from her, which I'll sort of talk you through. But she's thinking with, she's coming out of a philosophic tradition. She's thinking with Nietzsche's notion, there is no doer behind or before the deed. The doing of the deed produces the being of the doer. So this is also what I said earlier, sort of stumbling in language. I'm stumbling both because I'm trying to sort of talk out loud with you and explain concepts that are actually difficult, but also it's that the language itself is failing us here, because we speak in these grammatical sentences with a subject, a verb, an object. And if you think about the becoming of the subject through gender, this person becomes a woman through the doing of, certain kinds of performances or through the ways in which others interact with her. You still put the person before the doing. So language actually gives us an order of things, at least in English and also in most Romance languages. It gives us an order of action as if the subject came before the language, or as if the subject came before the doing, the speaking, right? But the idea is that this is why the performative utterance becomes so helpful. The saying of the words is the being of the subject. So the doing of gender becomes the being of the subject, who could then speak meaningfully of herself, I did that, and identify with that I, even as there's going to be a gap between the I. Every single day, multiple times a day, I perform the I, I perform the I, I perform the I, so seamlessly that I experience myself as continuity in time, and others perceive me that way too. But the grammar of the sentence, the person becomes a woman, actually already confuses the temporality. It happens in an instance, and it happens over and over again at the same time. In an instance, and repeated. In an instance, always. And we want to think about the temporality. In an instance, repeatable, the always. But I mentioned that gender for Butler is a compulsory performance, right? So in that sense, it's not a performance we wake up each day and like, which gender shall I be today? We might actually wake up in the morning and say, all right, shall I dress more boyishly or shall I dress more girlishly? Now, that is a volitional decision, but you're making this decision within a set of gender norms that you did not choose. So in that sense, it's constrained. That part wasn't volitional. You don't get to actually just say, this is what gender norms are, right? There's a set of norms that you're reacting against. But it's more deeply not volitional. So that's a kind of like a banal way in which it's volitional. I'm going to decide if I'm going to dress one way or another. But you're working against a baseline you didn't choose, and your desire to transgress or your desire to conform is not fully in your control. So there's something deep that becomes sedimented that you did not choose. So how can you unchoose what you never chose in the first place? And how can you unchoose, this is the deeper question, how do you unchoose what you came to identify with and you keep choosing every day as if it's true? How do you unchoose what in some sense you couldn't but always choose? Because you have to be either a woman or a man. Or maybe you get to be genderqueer or transgender because there's more space for that. But you're still having to position yourself in relation to gender. You can't opt out. Right? So what does choice look like? What does agency look like here? You can be punished for not doing your gender right, but you also can be deeply rewarded for doing your gender right. And this is the part about what you didn't choose that you can come to identify with as something you would keep choosing. It can be deeply pleasurable to conform to gender norms. It can be deeply pleasurable to transgress them too. Right? Butler is often identified with talking about gender transgression, but I do want us to think about the ways in which everyday performances of gender for subjects who are not seen as transgressive or seen as stably male or stably female, that's a lot of work too, right? A lot of work, a lot of training goes into that.
Hi, I'm Amy Hollier and I'm a celebrity makeup artist. Today I'm going to show you how to make your face look really natural with a little makeup. So to create a really fresh, natural makeup look, you want to start by cleansing and moisturizing your skin. And then you can...
It's you, but better. And it's this particular promo has gotten like more than 1 million hits, more than 1 million views, right? I watched it numerous times, so I'm sure that I've contributed like some dozen of those, 500,000 plus hits. But it's you, but better, and it's about producing a natural look. So I actually want to take this really seriously. I mean, like the activity, the training in becoming what you already supposedly were, more natural, you, but better, right? This is gender performativity. Right? It's gender performativity under the conditions of late capital, right? So it's also a commodification because they want to sell you a product to help you become the better you, to help you be more natural. But it's paradoxical, right? Gender is natural, and here's about producing a natural kind of feminine beauty. But you have to work at it and pay for it and get with a product and with this celebrity makeup artist who's going to talk us through it as well. I mean, just... The YouTube is a really fantastic instruction manual in what gender performativity is. All right. So, actually, both this quote from Butler and this other one are actually from an essay she published not long after the publication of Gender Trouble. So Gender Trouble came out in 1990, and the last chapter, which is actually the shortest chapter in the book, I think it's only 7 or so pages, is the one where she really, she's worked through, she spends the first, it's also a deceptively little book in terms of the number of pages, but what she does is she sort of like talks about how gender is imagined in a range of philosophic texts that precede her, especially going to psychoanalytic theory. She's arguing with Lacan, she's arguing with Freud. She looks at feminist theorists writing in the wake of Freud and Lacan, some psychoanalytic, some Marxist, like so Luce Irigaray, Monique Fatigue. So she's looking to a European feminist tradition and how they've thought about what does it mean to become woman. She begins by quoting Simone de Beauvoir's "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman," right? So what is this becoming of woman? What is this becoming of man? What is this becoming of gender? But she doesn't get to talking about sort of advancing a theory of gender as performative until like the last 7 pages, but she's leading up to that. And those last 7 pages then became quickly misunderstood as advancing a theory of gender as volitional performance. And she was explicitly arguing against gender as volitional. She's interested in the ways in which we sort of take it on as second nature, but again, it's produced through doing. So then she writes an essay that's published, I think, a year after Gender Trouble, Imitation and Gender Insubordination, just a terrific essay, in which she sort of basically summarizes the argument of Gender Trouble. So if you want to find one thing to read by Judith Butler, you can't get your hands on Gender Trouble, or reading it in English is too daunting, and even if you're a first language English speaker, too daunting, go to this essay, Imitation and Gender Insubordination. It's in a couple different anthologies. It's a really fantastic, very, I think, helpful reintroduction to the argument of Gender Trouble. But she argues that actually, she's arguing, again, still against the idea that gender is a volitional performance. But, yes? Oh, volitional, something you get to will. Volitional, like you get to choose in an active, conscious way. Thank you for asking. So she's arguing strenuously against the idea that gender is a volitional performance, right? She wants to stress it's performative. It produces us. It generates our experience of being a subject in the world, the doing of gender. But, and this is where performance, and here we are in a particular kind of performance space, volitional performance do become important, because she thinks that performance in the self-conscious scripted way, or in the self-conscious unscripted way, right? But performance, when deliberately taken up, can maybe expose to us something of the way in which gender performativity works, we can see in a chosen performance, a willed performance, something of the way in which gender is being enacted on us, not by choice. Does that make sense? Theater, performance art can show us something we can't see when we're in it, and we're all in gender. So there's something about volitional performance that gives you maybe a kind of sideways look at yourself. When you're in it, you can't see it, but you suddenly get a different glimpse. And this insight came to her. She said, while reading a book, a very famous book by the anthropologist Esther Newton about female impersonators in the 1960s. So Esther Newton did an anthropology of biological men who were impersonating women, and usually in the gay scene, drag clubs. And she understood, reading this book and then thinking about drag, that drag, right, the male-bodied person impersonating a woman, and part of the entertainment was, oh, you know it's not really a woman, and yet you see all these signs of femininity. The gap between the real and the artifice becomes important to the performance. She understood that drag actually was exposing that no gender is real. All gender is produced through acts, through simulations as if real. But some gendered doings in the world are given the status of being real. Some bodies are seen as actually a woman and actually a man and rewarded for it. Other bodies are seen as not doing it right. They're failed, or they're actually trying to be the wrong kind of gender, and they're punished for it. But actually, there's no real. We're all enacting a version of the real, or maybe in the case of drag, enacting a version of the not real. And this performance of I'm not really that, but I can do it really well, gives, again, you the glimpse, the gap between the performative, the gender you must be, and the performance, the ways in which you can rework the conventional, culturally legible signs of gender to put them into a different direction, to queer them, as it were, right? There's a space that opens up between the conscious performance of gendered rules and the unconscious, the taken on the socially mandated performative. That space is theater. That space might be a drag club. That space might be performance art. So there's something about the volitional performance that opens up a different way, not just of seeing gender, but arguably of being it, right? Maybe all gender is a drag, but if all gender is a drag, a simulation of the real, remember, all gender is a drag, a simulation of the real, some performance of the real are rewarded for being real. Really good. Other performances of this is my real get punished, right? So there are social consequences to these performances. All right, this is the artist Vaginal Davis. Actually performed a fair amount in Europe. I don't know if Vag has performed here. So Vaginal Davis is African-American performer. Performs drag is inadequate to describe both the kinds of performances that she does, but also the ways in which this persona is more than a persona. Vag still travels under a passport with a male name, and actually uses that male name, the given name for Clarence Sanders, uses that name in the passport, and also performs in the name of Clarence Sanders for a white militiaman drag. So I actually want to show you a kind of drag that isn't this isn't a male-bodied person performing female drag. This is a dark-skinned African-American drag queen performing as a white militiaman. Although Butler does not talk about racial performatives and gender trouble, she talks about racial performatives in the context of Paris is Burning and Bodies That Matter. The notion of the doing in the world that becomes or gets read as identity also has really interesting and important implications for racial performativity, for the doing of racial being. Right? And here in this particular performance, again, it's significant. Vaginal Cream Davis is very tall, like 6'2", is doing this white militiaman, cannot pass as white. This is not someone who passes as white, but is presenting as white, as racist, as fully identified with white power. And so it's a disturbing performance of drag. It's not like light, campy drag. So there's something really interesting about the ways in which Vaginal Davis is playing with race here, in the persona of Clarence Sanders, which is also given name.
Look at us. We're white, we're right, we're sexy, we're beautiful. Look at my bass player, Dean the Bag. Have you never seen such a beautiful white tight ass? Look at that white ass. You'd swear that he was black because of that ass. But he's not. He's pure white from Scandinavia. He's white. And look at my bodyguard over here. The corporal. He's white too. Look at these big tits he's got, man. Shit. Hey, ladies, do you want...
Part of what vaginal Crim Davis is doing there is also, as Clarence, is also this performing a kind of hyper-masculine male bonding. And we'll also make we'll make comments about having, sort of renounced homosexuality, even as lots of sexualized things are being said to male compatriots. So there is this really interesting, what does it mean to, we talk about drag as usually a male-bodied person doing femininity, but masculinity is also drag too. So, but it's hard to, I was about to say it's hard to perform masculinity as drag, to out it as drag. Right, femininity, because we saw that ad, right? You have to, all the effort women have to go into in looking natural, right? We can just be you, but be better you. There aren't the same kinds of ads. Like, there are more, but there isn't certainly not the same number directed at being a better man. Or they're different characters. So what does it mean to out masculinity as a drag too? And that's part of, and white masculinity, that's part of what Crim Davis is doing here. One of the weird things about Austin is he just can't think about theater and performance. To authorize his analysis of language and to sort of talk about the authority of performative utterances. He wants to disqualify anything said in performance as having any effect in the world, right? And what's interesting about this, so he just disqualifies, if you say it on stage, if you say it in a poem, this is a special kind of language. It's just hollow. It's not something that your performative utterance can't actually be doing in the world. If we do a stage marriage up here, it's not going to actually be powerful in the world. If I yell fire, you're in the midst of a play, it's not powerful in the world. It's not efficacious in the same way. But I can't even describe things. States of affairs I'm describing aren't descriptive. So basically, theater is disqualified as being efficacious. And I think this is significant because Butler's going to talk about, no, in fact, efficacy in the world, things that can affect things in the world, work on the model of theater and performance. Right? Not for nothing was Plato in a panic about what performance could do. Because actually, a lot of what is enacted in the world takes the form of ritualized repetition. But Austin disqualifies it. And I actually want, because here we are in this theater space, like to take theater seriously, it can really do things. It can really trouble things.
We'll hear argument now in number 9026, Michael Barnes versus Glenn Theater, Inc. Mr. Ewell.
Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the Court. In Indiana, under Indiana Code Section 35454-1, a person cannot leave his home naked and walk down the street. He cannot give a political speech in a park without
being in trouble.
That's correct. He would get in trouble, Your Honor, if he walked into
I thought that was worth hearing again. All right, so that's actually the opening moments of a court case to do with whether or not the state of Indiana could ban nude dancing, all nude dancing. Ultimately, the court decided in a split vote, 5-4, they could. But they spent a lot of time discussing whether or not dance was an expressive activity. Did dance basically have a message to communicate? And if so, what kind of message? So if dance is speech, what does dance say? There are all sorts of exceptions for the arts, like art, an artistic performance. The musical Hair was cited in the case. There's nudity in the musical Hair. And so that would not be caught up in this regulation. You could have the musical Hair in which there was dancing. You could even have people dancing on stage completely nude as part of the action of the play. And that would not be subject in the state of Indiana to this regulation. So there's something about nude dancing, what is perceived as being for your erotic titillation, as opposed to for your aesthetic education, or for your sing-along pleasure in the audience. We can all start singing, Let the Sun Shine In, right? There's something that the court's like, well, what does dancing say? And do we understand that? And do we like what it's saying? So you have these 9 justices debating with the 2 lawyers, one for the state of Indiana, one representing these 2 nude dancing clubs that sued because they said, look, our free speech rights are being affected because dance is expressive communication. Dancing in the nude, fully nude, sends a different message than dancing with your nipples covered up or dancing with a G-string. There's a different message. Nudity communicates differently than not quite nudity. And so the court's like, well, what's the message of nudity? But especially when connected to the moving, dancing body. And they couldn't, ultimately, they said, no, it's sort of expressive, but you can still ban it. They couldn't figure out what to do with this kind of performance. But one of the things that I think is at stake here is that the law depends on the fantasy that it is objective, that there is actually no doer behind the deed there either. It's just the law. It's not performance. It's authoritative. So there's something in which the law, too, is rivalrous with theater for its efficacy. You have to perform as if authoritative, perform as if objective. So it stumbled over how to analyze dance and nudity, in part because it was stumbling over itself, I would argue, being unclothed, as actually being part of a social constellation, social force, history, sedimented bodies. Its real is manufactured, too. Right? There's something about this prospect of the nude female body in particular that exposed the justices, the behind of the law, let us say. And one of the ways to see this, and I'll end with this clip, is from a really fascinating, and some of you know this theater company, Elevator Repair Service. It was here recently, I hear from Mark, doing GATS. They repeated the words of this court case, the oral argument. And they repeated it in a way, so there are no cameras allowed into Supreme Court hearings. We have audio recordings that date back to 1955, but they will not allow cameras in. The justices have banned cameras because they're afraid that they claim because then the justices will start performing for the camera. I think this is a ridiculous argument, in part because they're being recorded and they're performing for each other anyway. They're constantly trying to top each other, right? So there's something about not wanting to be seen that preserves their aura of objectivity. The disembodied voice, right? This case is all about embodied speech. So they couldn't handle it. The theater company, Elevator Repair Service, did a really bravura redo of it, in which, and all the videos have disappeared. Let's see if we can get in. They put the body way back in. Sometimes media are trouble too. Okay. They are doing words verbatim from the oral arguments, but as far as I know, there was no actual nudity during the oral arguments. But it's significant that the body that we see nude, this is a case about nude female bodies, becomes the male lawyer arguing on behalf of the theaters, who becomes so, it's trying so hard to convince the justices that dancing expresses something that he ends up in despair stripping off.
Every movement becomes communication. And the First Amendment applies to everything, including what I'm doing here today.
Well,
I wanted to give you a flavor of the manic activity. This is not what a Supreme Court, well, the Supreme Court has lots of activity, but not manic like that. But theater, here's a case where theater, in this case, a re-performance of theater actually shows what the court otherwise tries to conceal, the fact that there are bodies beneath the robe, right? And here is part of what I'm talking about, where there's the ability of performance, a conscious performance, being able to step into the gap and out the performativity that would hide that hides its own operative conditions, or that can't even see its operative conditions. So there's something about performance, which Richard Schechner has described as twice behaved behavior. That's never for the first time. There's a set of social scripts, conventions upon which it depends. It seems to me it's actually more than twice behaved. This can actually intervene to show that show that it's never for the first time. It depends upon conventions. The conventions can be changed. Theater, art, performance can show us this otherwise, so the performativity that is actually our doing. Basically, how do we undo gender? How do we undo subjectivity? One of the suggestions is that performance might be one of the ways to start doing so. And let me end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I will start by asking if someone has questions. While I personally have some fragments of ideas that came up to my mind while I was listening to you, to such a rich presentation with so many moments and subjects. So I do have several different comments on different moments of your presentation, so to say. But maybe I will ask you if you have questions, and then I'll come back to one of my fragmentary comments.
Hello? Oh, it's working. Sorry. Well, thank you very much. I hope my question will come clear, because I thought I would have a bit more time to think it through, but well, anyway, here it goes. I was wondering whether your research, I know, well, Butler goes a lot into this issue of identity, especially giving an account of oneself and all that.
Right.
But I really try to wonder about this issue of identity. Like, we have focused here on gender, but I always wonder whether performance can as well bring us this notion or knowledge that pretty much everything is performative, like from the baseline, I reckon. And well, that's why, you know, you put a wig on and suddenly you can do different things, or you change, like, especially language does that a lot. If you change, like, I speak much better in English in public than Portuguese. It's just much easier because there's all these preconceptions. So I was wondering whether there's, I don't know, your studies also go along that line or not, or what you'd have to say about this. I know it's a very tricky issue, identity and subjectiveness, but I'm really interested in this performativity of what we are and what we can be, and how art and performance can really make us notice that we can be something else. And we keep changing all the time, but I mean, that there are other possibilities. I guess it's pretty much that. Thanks.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I think, certainly Judith Butler and many other thinkers have been sort of critical of the category of identity, the way in which, if identity is understood as fixed, unchanging, rooted somehow in biology, there are different ways to root identity as fixed that wouldn't necessarily have to go biologically. We could actually think about religious conceptions of identity, perhaps, although there might be more change built in there, depending upon how conversion is understood. But, you know, we live in, many of us live in political systems in which identity is nonetheless necessary. Like, we actually, speaking the language of rights often requires staking claim to a group identity. Making your case to the state to petition for access that wasn't previously given requires so often speaking the language not only of identity, but an identity that is legible to the law, right? So, I mean, one of the dilemmas is that even those of us who might be hypercritical of identity as a fiction, well, we're never as stable as we think. We actually do change over time in ways we're often not allowed to talk about. It's still, in certain kinds of contexts, we have to speak as if identity is real, as if it means X, Y things. But it is, it is real because it has real effects. But, you know, so we also have to, depending on the context, we might have to, you know, like, I'm a social constructionist, but I still talk as if race is real in this context because the court's asked me to, or I'll still say that gender means this because the court's asked me to, but, you know, maybe a few sentences on from argument before the court, I'll cede some possibility that gender's more variable, or that race is a social invention with profound material consequences. I mean, but my first argument might have to be through the language of identity. So there's that. But there's also the way in which we also come to identify with these terms. What could loosen the hold, but in a way that won't send us into free fall, right? And this is, I think, these are collective questions too, but I mean, I do believe, and I'm not alone in believing so, performance studies is filled with articles and books that make such claims about the world-making possibility of performance, understood broadly. It could be small club performances, like the kinds of things, you know, Vaginal Davis might do performing at Bricktop in LA, or big theater, or, you know, a small, let's say a performance art, you know, sort of a gallery. I do believe that performance can actually help to spark collective formations, right? That it can be world-making, it can become the basis for people to imagine other kinds of political possibilities and other kind of life possibilities. And, you know, there's a whole huge literature in performance studies that makes such a claim, but the thing that's really important to mark, and this is sort of what I've been writing about a lot lately, is that such claims about the world-making capacity of performance, like it can reach in and change you in your substance, these are not just made by leftists, by secularists. I mean, there are a whole lot of religious subjects, conservative religious subjects, who believe in the power of religious performance to reach in and change you. You know, evangelical Christians in the United States use hell houses, missionary theater, to target young people, to convert them to a particular form of evangelical Christianity, right? So, and there's a long tradition, a religious tradition, in many religious traditions, not just in Christianity, of actually using theater as a vehicle for religious conversion and change. So, I mean, I do believe that performance can change you, can change your sense of who you are, can in some sense change your identity. And we don't know in advance how it will change you. It doesn't line up with any neat political ideology. It never has, right? So this is, in some sense, I sometimes feel like wag my feet. It's not just for the left. It's sometimes for the left behind, you know? So, yeah, thank you for your question.
Maybe, well, now I'll start by doing one of my first comments that has more to do with when you were talking about blasphemy. And yes, it actually came to my mind something that we have spoken before, which was this, there has been a succession of scandals concerning censorship. Two of them in Portugal recently. One is, there was a magazine in which Análise Social, in which there was a visual essay out of the walls of Lisbon protesting against Troika. IMF, Central Bank, European Central Bank, austerity measures, and it was banned. Suddenly, the direction of ICS suspended. I think this is the story. Suspended the entire magazine because there was an obscene word on it. So suddenly this started. Another thing is the recent banish of a cartoon book that was making fun out of Tintin dans le Congo in Gulbenkian. So the administration of Gulbenkian for some moment didn't allow to, but this because in that book it was a highly satirical, extremely violent détournement of Tintin in Congo, turning out the positions of the colonizer and the colon. And the third one is MACBA, the one we've told. I don't know if you know, but in MACBA there has been this censorship out of a statue, I guess, out of King Juan Carlos being sodomized by an activist, while at the same time sodomizing a pastor alemão. I don't know how you. I think this is the story. So all of these are examples that came out in the public sphere where censorship came again, and all of them have extreme images that can be considered blasphemy, or I don't know. So one thing is like, why is this coming back now? What is this return? I don't know if
I mean, I guess the short answer is that, I mean, such forms of regulation of speech, expression never went away, right? So I don't know that it's returned. I mean, the question would be sort of what are the new forms, and sort of in the first example, if I understood properly, so here's a journal or a magazine that's sort of being anti-IMF, so it's actually a critique of neoliberal political economy.
But,
right?
but the reason why
they focus on this one particular obscene word. So this is a great example of how, and this is a point Gail Rubin makes in a famous essay called Thinking Sex, that, you know, sex is overburdened with moral worry, it's overburdened with legal attention, so that sex becomes a wonderful alibi, or we could, if we use psychoanalytic language, could say it's a displaced site of anxiety. So sex becomes an alibi and excuse for the state to actually repress a critique of the political, sort of economic and political organization. And so in one sense, there might be this a kind of simple version of hypocrisy, right? Like we want to get this magazine out. We want to punish the people circulating these anti-capitalist messages. And we use sex as a reason. And sex works because a lot of people who might actually potentially be sympathetic to the critique of economic precarity, economic austerity, might still be themselves anxious or sympathetic about sex or sympathetic to a critique of obscenity. I mean, I think that sex becomes a dumping ground for lots of other kinds of anxieties.
Yes, in fact, it was the expression sacrifícios do caralho, and this was the expression that led to this banned, which, so it's not your ass, but it will be your cock or something like that. But actually, the thing is, like, you cannot use such an extreme language, and actually, it divided pretty a lot Portuguese society, even within the left, which was very, very interesting. But what I was thinking is that all this happens alongside, and when in Spain there's something else going on, which is the Lei Mordaça, which is actually something, it is a law that will be approved in July, and if it is approved, it can, one of the things, you cannot share images on social networks that are considered as incitation to violence. But this suddenly goes on to the images, which is something that also has been happening in all these events, which are these images that work as discourse, which is also, and this sharing, just sharing the image would, so yeah, this is more a comment.
Very interesting.
And yeah, so this, maybe another question, and then because I have fragmentary thoughts, this was one subject, and so.
Hello. Firstly, I would like to apologize for waving my hand so much. I was trying to to be noted down. Firstly, thank you for your intervention. It was amazing. And I've been coming to all the conferences, and both in here and basically everywhere I go nowadays. I'm always very attentive, even not consciously, but when it happens, I realize it, of I'm transgender and questions regarding trans issues. And you talked about the ways words produce meanings, and words produce actions, and words are actions, etc. And you used some words in a way that usually upsets me, in the sense that I see this discourse being repeated several times: men, women, and transgender people, as if transgender people is a gender category. I'm sorry about my pronunciation.
Yes, I understand, yeah.
As in the way, like, I know cisgender is a word that's very critiqued inside the academia.
Right.
I haven't read a lot about, I find it politically absolutely relevant. I haven't academically thought about it, but the way you say, I say in general, men, women, and transgender people, as if the transgender people that are men and women are somehow less legitimate, right. And this subtlety of discourse continues to reproduce. I'm sorry, I slept 2 hours, I'm not...
No. You're being fantastically articulate, and I really appreciate what you're saying. I mean, this is where language is actually exhausting, right? And this has nothing to do with only having slept for 2 hours. I don't like the word cisgender for a lot of reasons, which I'm happy to talk about. And I really appreciate your calling this out and calling me out in this, because actually I don't even know what a man or a woman is, right? And so there's a certain sense, Jack Halberstam, under the name Judith Halberstam, at earlier moment, Halberstam had written an article, and I say Jack Halberstam under the name Judith Halberstam because Female Masculinity, which is still in print, is still signed by Judith Halberstam. Halberstam's more recent publications are signed as Jack, and that's a deliberate decision that Halberstam has made, right? So we can travel under different names, and actually there isn't even one way to speak the language of transgender as well. But there's a sense, Halberstam wrote an essay many years ago that sort of posed this, it was a provocative question, like basically, maybe aren't we all transgender in a certain way, right? Because the child that's read as being female, she is ascribed to this female body, is sex, she, But there's all the activity that goes into making it. We saw this clip, right? The makeup, the learning to high heels. You're supposed to. I'm not supposed to do speak like sorry, I'm Italian American. I use my hands a lot, right? But you're not supposed to. You're supposed to hold your body in a certain way. Like femininity is also a transgender, female to feminine. This is Lisa Dugan has quipped about this, the F to F, right? So there's a certain sense in which we're all transgender insofar as the supposed meaning in our body is brought out of us and performed. But then people who identify as transgender actually get often punished for being transgender, right? So one wants to sort of both say, yes, we're all transgender, and there are materialities to claiming that or being read as that. And it's like how to say, when I say woman, do I mean? I mean, I actually mean anyone who, like these days, anyone who's willing to identify as a woman, I'll have you, right? I mean, like, given the misogyny that still exists. So like a female, so I think I was, a female-bodied person who identifies with femininity and is identified by others as feminine. That might be one version of a woman. But it could be a male-bodied person or a body called male-bodied that identifies as woman and isn't necessarily read that way. That could be a woman too. Or body doesn't want to be read stably as one or the other, but might in certain contexts want to identify as woman for political reasons. Or, that's part of what I do think of when I say woman or when I say man. But it's true, if I then say woman, man, and transgender, it seems as if, there's this third sex. Actually, there are so many more genders than 3, right? So it's how do we actually, what words will we use? And one of the things I really appreciate about also the way you made a really important point, and the way you made your point was also very generous, right? A generosity. You said, the way I said something would ordinarily, you said, you usually get upset, but you actually step back and look, well, how do we think about this? You actually made this intervention about words that can be heard in ways that are hurtful, or words that are actually not just hurtful, but actually philosophically, politically do work. And then you made your intervention, you asked a question which is about the generosity of thinking together. How do we, not just how could I do better, but what will we do? We are creatures in language. So how can we use terms, and this is a point Butler makes, how can we use terms that are, in some sense, language is speaking through us. Can we rework the terms? Can we work them in ways that allows for maximum flexibility for the future? If we write a word into law now, it might not be so flexible later. How do we, the provisionality of the sign, right? How do we let others mess up without, and sort of call them on it in a way that doesn't think it's somehow they are an error, right? So I think that's I don't have an easy answer to this. That was a long-winded answer, but these terms become long-winded, right? Think about the wildness of gender. It's far wilder than any of the categories we've so far come up with. People live gender so multiply and richly and wildly. The short answer was pronouns are so complicated. So is gender. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your lecture on gender. I just got a question. Do you think that gender will always be subject to performance in order to become what it is? In the sense that whatever gender I have to become myself, I have to be performing. Mm-hmm. So that was just my question.
The short answer is yes. Because I actually don't know what gender is outside of performance in the sense of ongoing activities in the world. Even, we hold self-images inside us of what our bodies are supposed to be like, what they're supposed to feel like, and these are, even when sitting still, we're still performing gender, right? So I don't know what gender would be outside of social relation. When I think of, that gender takes place also in social relation, then we might internalize the meanings of those social relations.
This is a question from someone watching us online on the streaming. Actually, we have two now. Okay, so I'll try to ask you both. The first one is, what are your questions or thoughts regarding the word cisgender? And the second one is, can the discourse game and its attendant skills help the gender struggles?
All right. With regard to cisgender, so cisgender as a term, it's CIS gender, and it was created as, in some sense, as a rebuke, an important rebuke to the ways in which, precisely what you were saying, right, that transgender, somehow like, transgender bodies are the gender trouble bodies. They're these stable women, stable bodies that get called women, stable bodies that get called men. There need to be a term that outs and names the privilege that comes from being someone who gets the social recognition of being a man, of being a woman. I started to say social reward, but I said recognition because actually, as probably a lot of individuals who identify as women can tell you, there are all sorts of punishments that come from being someone who's recognized as being a woman, whether or not they identify as one, but called out as being a woman, right? So the term cisgender was a way to mark actually a position of privilege in relationship to the social meaning, recognitions, and oftentimes rewards of being in gender. So I get that, like politically important. What I find difficult about the term is it seems to me that cisgender actually presents a fantasy, because to be cisgender, or to do cisgender, cisgender is actually about some sort of, it imagines an alignment between the sex ascribed to a body at birth, female or male. So there's an alignment between that sex ascribed at birth, let's say female, the way in which that body is read in the world and recognized, oh, that female body is read as woman. And not only that, the third piece of it is that you, the female-bodied person, recognized socially by others as a woman, actually identify with the category of woman too. And do so in a way that doesn't, the imagination is that this is not psychologically difficult. So what I find that to me, cisgender presents a fantasy of perfect alignment between inside and outside, and the surface of the body seals the deal. And I guess I just wonder, are there actually any cisgender women and cisgender men, if that's what cisgender means, a body that's in alignment with socially ascribed sex, interior psychological orientation towards gender and in the world? Because if a theory of gender performativity is accurate, right, then we're all having to produce our gender at all times. Some subjects get rewarded for it. Some subjects actually don't, might even be rewarded for, oh, look, so I'm going to go, to the makeup counter at, pick your department store and, have my makeover, pay for becoming more feminine than I already am, or, go to the gym, become more masculine than I already am, right? So that cisgender subjects, so-called, are also having to work all the time at producing their gender. So I guess I feel like there's no such person as cisgender. So I worry that the term, and I get it politically, I worry that the term mystifies the fact that all gender is performatively produced, even the gender of people that seem to be stable with respect to identity, social recognition, and surface, like inside and outside are matched. That's an effort too. Constant effort, constant self-scrutiny, and scrutiny by others has produced that apparent, I think it's only an apparent alignment.
We actually have one more question. Can you still answer the second one? Can the discourse game and its attendant skills help the gender struggles? And we have another one after that.
Okay.
And it's the last one from the chat.
Well, I guess since I believe with Foucault that there's no place outside discourse, right? We can't go outside language. We're in language. I mean, that is a system of signs, a system of interpretation. There's no place outside, so all of our struggles are happening in language. Certain claims made by feminists, there are multiple kinds of feminist theory, multiple kinds of queer theory, critical race theory, multiple kinds of critical race theory, but certain kinds of arguments might work better in certain contexts than others. But I guess maybe I am a professor of gender and sexuality studies. I want to believe that feminist arguments and queer arguments about gender as performative could make a difference to the kind of politics we make. We might be more hesitant to make essentializing or biologizing claims about what sexuality is, for example, or what gender is. We might try to think more loosely about how we argue for extending rights.
Okay, and the last question, which it's actually related to that. Do you think that movements such as feminism and gender equality rights and projects will eventually lead to the nullification of gender itself?
I guess the short answer is I hope not. Because I actually think that, and this is, that is to think about gender trouble, right? Actually, gender is, yes, it's a compulsory performance, but as Butler argues and others have argued that, these prohibitions also incite transgressions. We make lies with each other on the basis of how we recognize each other in gender, and we recognize each other in many more ways than the language is adequate to. So it seems to me that the issue is not getting rid of gender, but loosening the hold that binary gender has, and maybe even, and just having much wider, actually acknowledging the much wider and wilder array of gender that already exists. So this would be about pluralizing gender, I'm not interested in a gender neutral or gender less future. I'm interested in a gender rich and gender plural future. And how do we get there? And I think we get there in struggle with each other, in a struggle that takes place in language, and sometimes a struggle that will be over language, the words we use, especially the words we might try to write into law. But it's not just in struggle. I think it's going to require a lot of fun, troublesome fun.
And maybe also bringing, as you did, and also with Vaginal Davies, just bringing other things like race, class, and all these multiple things we can have to think along the gender conditions as well, I think. I don't know if we can have one last question, or if we do have last one. I don't know, sorry, if you're okay.
So thank you again. Right. Okay, this is one stupid last question, but you need one. So, I have a question. I received the manifeste of the Femin, right? And in French, I'm French, so it was this Marine Le Pen discourse for Jeanne d'Arc Day. And all right, so I want to know what do you think about this Femin, and how do they use? How do they use maybe the feminine or the concept of woman, in their movement, and does it help or not, really, feminism? So, what do you think first, and all these little other questions?
So are you thinking about a particular manifesto?
Well, yes, the Manifesto of Femin, but actually there's not a lot of theoretical ideology, I think. But what about their action, like the way they act, and like they use the female body, right? That's what they throw to everybody. This is my So what do you think about this? Does it really serve or not, the feminism? And, what do you think? Yeah, how do you say it? Sorry. Well, how do you think? What kind of reaction do you think it can also make, people's faces?
I guess I have not paid enough attention to this group. I know the group you're referring to. And the French scene has some of its own specificities, right? But it strikes me that we need multiple feminisms, right? So I don't know that I want to set down a list of rules that feminist performative action or feminist political action has to take. One thing that does strike me as interesting about the use of the female body as a form of protest is the female body remains a certain kind of scandal, right? And again, the French context then becomes really specific. The imagined French citizen body is a pretty narrowly imagined French citizen body. To go back to an earlier generation of French feminist thinkers, here, Luce Irigaray, one of the things she talks about is the idea of using femininity against itself. So, like, actually making a display of the artifice of femininity so as to, I mean, she says so as to create space for the finding of the real femininity. I don't think there's a real femininity or a real there to get to, but the idea is that a certain kind of hyper performance of femininity could expose the compulsory masquerade of femininity. By you reproduce it so faithfully, you're kind of, it's hyper, it's campy even, and excess, but it's female-bodied persons doing the performance of femininity that out the masquerade. Again, she talks about in the context of, like, you mime the masquerade, a mimicry of masquerade. So potentially that might be one of the things going on in this use of the female body. I guess the question is, how can you use it without asserting that it has one meaning, right? Can you open up the female body to lots of different things that body could mean?
Well, maybe I will try to briefly bring up the conversation again to something that I found really interesting, which was the relation between the law and so the law which is written, and often when it is written, it's often not, it has to do with lasting, right? This thing of like why the Constitution, why the law? It's so that we can endure something, and the performance of that law. So in this sense, of course, I'm thinking of two things, as we also thought about, which was one is the abortion laws, and the other one is the gay marriage. So these two things are written in the law, and from then on will be the rule. I also want to call the attention to these step backs of these laws, particularly in Spain, which is first is the abortion law, and now, if Ley Mordaza will go, it's the speech law, the freedom of speech law. So it's like just to make us think of also how this identity politics, or this how do you set down things on a written way. So this is something that I would like to call the attention, and I think it's really interesting to see this thing of having a precedent and how often that goes back to the religion. So it is a religious precedent that extends in a society. So yeah, so maybe then to end, I will ask you to talk about it. And then I'm going to just say a little anecdote that I found very, very funny, which is in Portugal at the end. Well, let me see. I don't really remember, but like 18th century or something like that. There is this fight between two kings. It is almost between two kings. One Dom Pedro and Dom Miguel. One wins and the other goes away. And suddenly, a lot of kings start to appear. So a lot of people, like mad people, crazy people, just go to the villages and they act as if they were the king. And there is a novel that we study in school by Camilo, I think, that talks about one of these replicas of Rei Dom Miguel. But it's very interesting because it's this thing of what does the king does, and he always arrives to a place. He gives the hand to be kissing, and he signs up papers. And that's what it is to be king in a lot of villages. So this is kind of interesting. I'm bringing up the idea of the king because it's an obvious moment where authority comes from God. And comes from God goes. And then with Republic, we kill the king, so there's no God any longer, but still there is an entire hierarchy of rules and stuff that has the nation or the sovereign as kind of the God. So in one sense, this continuity between the religion and laicism has a huge tradition. But well, so just to sum up, maybe just to call the attention to this, what I think you brought us here, it's this very important of the law, the way it is performed, and how it can be misfired or contested. I don't know.
A lot of questions there. I mean, one thing I do want to say is that, the law does not exhaust neither legal categories nor legal rewards. Law does not exhaust the various ways we can imagine ourselves into being, nor does it exhaust the ways in which we're already making lives with other people and experiencing our own bodies, right? Law is hardly, law is actually not very capacious. I mean, law has limitations, right? And one danger, and this I'm thinking about the US context, but there's a danger in organizing political actions, political hopes towards the horizon of law, because that's a pretty low bar in certain ways. We might need legal protections, might need the extension of, let's say in the United States, of, the marriage franchise. But if we just speak law's language, we're leaving out all the other languages we're already speaking, the intimacies we're making, again, the bodies we're living. So I'm really interested maybe in sort of how do we not let legal performatives actually aren't fully exhaustive of who we are, but like what happens then when we do our conscious political actions, we're acting as if they are, they're not. So we need, like, what are the languages we're already speaking that we can continue to do outside the law? Again, when we go to law, we have certain things we have to ask in certain terms, but what other things can we ask for with each other without letting law cramp our imagination? And this is, I'm thinking of the language of as if, like, what if everyone acted as if they were king, right? And what that brought to mind is, well, fantastic, right? But this is part of the painful experience of too many. I mean, if social life is actually, we participate in the fiction that gender is real, that race is real, that other kinds of differences that are actually in the social, in history are real, biologically rooted, and there are material consequences to these fictions, these realized fictions, as it were, right? But we need our as-ifs to be recognized by others. I act as if I am a fill in the blank. I need someone else to ratify it for me. Because, and this, I'm thinking of the experience of, earlier when I was thinking, saying women, men, transgender, horrible shorthand. But when the child comes into the world, the doctor announces it's a boy, it's a girl. There are many more intersex children that are born than is commonly understood, right? But parents are, maybe some groovy parents are already imagining this, like, I would like I want to imagine a transgender child, or I want to imagine a child whose gender can change. I actually know some parents that actually are, trying to think about, what gender will my child become? This has been ascribed, this has been ascribed Y, but it's going to be really hard. And there's still the assumption that there are these, now maybe there are 3 options, right? So, I mean, how do we imagine not only ourselves into ongoing being, but imagine space for others? But we need recognition from others. This is something Judith Butler talks about extensively in giving an account of oneself in a precarious life. I mean, this is like, we need recognition. And so we need someone else to enter into our as-if. We can't just be in the if. We need the as well.
I think you answered. I was thinking on the also what was coming out of the square movement, which is this, in some squares or in some places they're thinking of an instituent moment, or even trying to draft out a charter for Europe. There has been several essays of trying to write down stuff that could last. So it was in that sense. But I think often those efforts are documents that are written to be discussed, so they are always performative, and up until now, one of the cases was Spain, and I think it ended up in Podemos and ahora, and a lot of people went into a representative democracy for a while, so I don't know. Well, many questions. Thank you so much, Anne.
Thank you.